Our show starts in 1847, which would be more than 5 years ago, okay? And roughly in the 1840s, Nebraska did not exist with anybody in it. It was people who were going through primarily. There were a few missionaries and a few fur traders and trappers here, but for the most part, people were going through. And in the 1847 era, a man decided to write a tour guide to the way west, the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Gold Trails, and so forth. He was the grandnephew of a man by the name of Washington Irving, who we remember about the legend of Sleepy Hollow and so forth. And his idea was to write a travel guide to take people from the East Coast to the West Coast. And to do that, he wanted to show them things along the way that they might see. Not necessarily things of a tourist information, but maybe where there might be wild game, where there might be fresh water, where there might be firewood, and so forth. And when they left the East Coast, one of the things they had was a traveler's guide, and with that guide, it showed what they needed to take with them, how many pounds of flour, how many pounds of salt, a shotgun, so forth and so on. So as they left, he wanted to put together a book along the trail. Now we think of a trail as a pencil line across a map, but that's not the way the Oregon Trail was at all. The Oregon Trail, of course, was a pencil line, but it was very wide, sometimes as much as a mile wide, because as they traveled, they would run across mud, then they would move the trail, or they would find no more firewood. They might move it a couple of miles one way or the other. And also along the way, they were looking for buffalo, places where they might be able to capture antelope or so forth to eat. These are the things he was looking for. And in order to write this book, he knew that if he took a pencil line across, he would not be able to show anybody much of anything. So he decided, first of all, I'll go across in one pencil line, then I'll come down and go back in another pencil line. But still, very narrow band. So what he did was he set out with a group of men, and they would camp. They would go, for example, near Ashland, and they would stop there for the night. Then the next morning, he would send people out in all 8 directions of the compass, and they would go out until about noon, then they would come back. They would report what they saw. That way, the trail is suddenly quite wide, and when it came back, it would be quite wide again. And as they came through this area and camped near Ashland, the people who went off towards the southwest reported seeing off in the distance a huge area of amorphous white, like a huge sheet of white paper on the ground. And it was something they didn't know what it was. So they decided to spend the night there and an extra day there and send out people the next day to see what it was they had seen out there. And when they got there, this is what they saw. It was a dry lake bed. Not much to see on the slide, so don't worry about it. It's just a dry lake bed. But it was pure white as a sheet of paper. Because what was happening was water below ground was dissolving salt. And the salt was here from hundreds, thousands of years before, when there was a great lake that encompassed this entire valley. Went as far north as probably what today we think of as Superior Street, or even further to the north, Havelock Avenue, Superior. It went as far east at least as 70th Street. We don't want to turn out all the lights. Yeah, leave one of them on. First of all, when I start to speak, half the audience falls asleep, the other half wants to break for the door, so we don't want anybody injured. Okay, so as this Salt Lake, which existed in this huge area, much like Salt Lake City, Utah, as it slowly shrank in size as the sun beat down on it, wind blew across it, and no water came in to really replace it, the lake kept shrinking. And what they saw was the area which would be around what we think of as Capitol Beach today, but also clear as far over probably as Charleston Street. Because when you come across the interstate connection to the airport, you drive between 2 lakes, which were one lake until they put the interstate connection through there. That was really the last remnant of water, other than at Capitol Beach Lake, that existed of this great inland salt lake, not a sea. But it was evaporating. And as it evaporated, of course, pretty soon you have nothing but a dry lake bed. But this dry lake bed was interesting in that twice a day, roughly 2:30 in the afternoon and 2:30 again in the morning, a mysterious water pressure would develop below ground, and come up and flood this dry lake with a water lake, maybe only 2 or 3 inches deep. Then it would mysteriously retreat back down into the ground again, only to come up another 12 hours later. Now, the American Indians had been using this for decades, maybe hundreds of years, we don't know, as a source of salt. They would lay a animal skin on the ground, and with a feather, they would dust the salt onto it. Or the salt, which kept getting thicker and thicker and thicker, day after day, week after week, they could simply chip the salt off. And we have records of the salt actually reaching maybe 3/4 of an inch thick, rock salt on the ground in the lake, because if it came up and went down, a little bit of water would evaporate each time, and that layer of salt would get thicker and thicker and thicker. Of course, there's a problem with anything that looks like it's free, and that is occasionally it would rain. Do you remember rain? My daughter may not, but I remember rain. And when it would rain, it would dissolve that rock salt, flush it right back down into the ground. Now, what was causing this? Well, we don't know for sure. There are several different theories. I think the easiest one to get your arms around is to think of Old Faithful, the geyser. Underground pressure builds up, and in the case of Old Faithful, every exact period of time, it sends out a force of water. Think of the same thing here, only this pressure existing below ground, which just finally culminates, brings the water up a couple of inches above the ground, and then goes back down again. So they saw this salt. Now, so what? Well, salt at that time was a very expensive commodity. It traded on par with flour per pound. And one of the things that people were told when they left their homes in the east to go west was to take X amount of pounds of salt. Salt was scarce. They didn't think they would find any salt on the trail until they got to Utah, and no salt after that until they got to the ocean. And of course, they needed salt. They needed salt just for flavoring. They needed it to harden their arteries. They needed to keep their blood pressure up. But mostly they thought they needed the salt to cure meat as they went, because there was no way to refrigerate it. So if they killed an antelope, for example, they could salt it down and move on with salted meat. Proved absolutely untrue, because the buffalo were in such quantities here, for example, that they never had to save anything. There was one herd of buffalo down not far from McCook, which numbered over 1 million head. So they just shot a buffalo, took the choicest piece of meat, and let it rot. So the salt necessarily wasn't that economically valuable for that purpose. But we do find people that are traveling towards the west, traveling a long ways out of their way to get to that salt here. They would come as much as 50 miles away, even 100 miles away. And remember, too, that they're traveling at 2.5 miles an hour. So 50 miles is a considerable distance away to come just to get that salt. But that's what they would do. And when they got here, if they got here at the wrong time, they would arrive after rain and all the salt would be washed away. There would be nothing but brine. However, there were enterprising people set up here. What they did was they would rent to people going through like a maple syrup pan, which is about maybe 4 inches thick and huge across, maybe 4 feet across, which you used to fill with maple syrup, and you'd build a fire under it and boil the water off and make maple syrup from maple sap. So they would rent these people a pan, and they could make salt themselves, or they could buy salt from the salt boilers, is what they called them, who lived here. Salt, as I said, was very expensive. So we see in the records of the travel diaries of people coming through here that when they got here, they realized, having come several hundred miles, that a lot of the junk they brought with them was just so much excess baggage. So in Lincoln, we find records of them, wasn't called Lincoln, of course, then, changing things for salt or bartering with it. Organs. By that I don't mean your organs, but like pump organs. Dishes, extra children, whatever they had that was in excess, they would trade for salt, and then they would move on. So salt became very important. And when Washington Irving's grandnephew published his book, suddenly in the 1840s, this area became known over a large area as a place to come to get salt. And as I said, people would come 50 or 100 miles out of their way to get to the salt. I am 19 days into a 2-week cold, so I'm still coughing a little bit. I think I'm not giving it to anybody, but I don't want to share it, but we'll try not to. So after the program, no hugs, no kisses. I'll say goodbye from a distance. So along come people like a man in Nebraska City who decides that a way to make money would be to establish a salt manufacturing plant here in what was soon to be called Lancaster, Nebraska. Later, Lancaster in 1867 will have its name changed and become Lincoln, but originally Lancaster or West Lincoln. West Lincoln probably existed as a post office before the city of Lincoln even thought about it. And that is down on around Charleston Street is where that post office was. Where, if some of you have been here long enough, you remember where Dr. White's Animal Clinic is. We think that's right about where that original post office was. Well, with 1854, Nebraska become a territory, people are beginning to settle here. And along comes our friend in Nebraska City, who we all know, J. Sterling Morton. And he asks a man to come with his company to the salt flats to manufacture salt, and he gets a government grant. Now, the federal government has, since the time of the Constitution, set aside saline lands as belonging to the federal government. Now, as we approach statehood, we find the state governor and the territorial governor selling land or selling the rights to the salt here. But interestingly enough, there seems to be no clear title. And later on, Kyle may remember this, the city of Lincoln got into some great scrapes with some of the land out here because it had been transferred so many times that they went back to this original Constitution and said, you know, the state and the territory never owned it to sell it or give it away. But at any rate, that's a story for another time. So you're probably all sitting on land you don't own, right? However, Kyle will help you out, just at a small fee. Okay, I'm sure that's all been worked out. Okay, so J. Sterling Morton sends this man named Captain Donovan up to Lancaster, where he establishes a salt company, the Crescent Salt Company. That big hesitation there was when you all said in your mind's eye, the Morton Salt Company. But the Morton Salt Company didn't actually specifically start here. It started as the Crescent Salt Company. And later, when the Morton Salt Company, or the Crescent Salt Company, moves to Chicago and changes the name to Morton, they discover places in Kansas where they can mine salt much cheaper. And so it goes away. There's a direct connection, but the Morton Salt Company, in a manner of speaking, either did or did not start here, depending on how you want to look at it. So Mr. Martin sends him up to do the dirty work and actual work of establishing the salt flats. Now the state is issuing land patents to various people to the point where they said when they came here, the land all around the salt flats was lined up with stakes and strings so that you were in different people's areas. And Mr. Morton had his own area staked out. In fact, he entered into a lawsuit here. He would have been all right because he thought, possession being 9 points of the law, one winter he would establish himself here and sit on this claim. And he would have been all right, except he ran out of firewood. So he went to the neighbor's claim, took some firewood, and burned it for heat. The neighbor sued him for conversion. He stole the firewood. And that became one of the first lawsuits in the area, was did J. Sterling Morton steal this firewood? Interesting sideline. Well, by 1869, one of the primary areas out here was obtained by a man named Horace Smith. And we wouldn't remember Mr. Smith, except he owned another business called Smith & Wesson. And he came here to work the salt flats. He then turned it over to his son and son-in-law, but that's part of another story. This is by the 1869 period. He had 75% of one of the state leases here. So a lot of people were becoming involved. We don't have any pictures really that show the area very clearly that early on. But we have this one. And we're not absolutely sure whether this is Mr. Morton's salt works or not. But we do know that the manufacture of salt, which was thought to be an economic commodity which would support the capital of Nebraska, which was brought here in 1867 from Omaha, didn't really work out very well. The problem was rain, and the fact there was no timber to burn to boil the water to remove the salt. So two things were acting against them. Mr. Morton devised a plan, and right in the middle of this dry lake bed, he set up this plan, which was consistent of a huge wooden vat, or sometimes two. You can see them right there. And these vats had lids on the top of them. Now, because rain was washing away the brine on a periodic basis, he brought in a bunch of lumber from Nebraska City in a train car, and he made ponds almost the size, maybe half the size of this room, and then put tar between them to hold them. Think of railroad ties with tar between them. And as the water came up at 2:30 in the morning and 2:30 in the afternoon, he would pump with windmills this salt water into this sort of holding tank, and then he would fill those two big vats with brine. On a sunny day, he could open the lid, and air blowing across the top of it like a chimney produces a vacuum, helps dry out the water, sun beating down on it, and over the course of a summer, each one of his wooden vats could produce several tons of salt. Sounds like plenty, but it was never an economic commodity which supported the capital as they hoped it would. Now, this is the first picture we have, and as I said, we think it's Mr. Morton's, but we can't absolutely be sure. This is going to go on for quite a while, an attempt to make salt, and finally in the mid-1880s, this state of Nebraska is going to issue a challenge to the salt boilers and offer them a bounty if they're able to produce salt. They still think they can do this. As late as 1885, a man by the name of Mr. Bullock got a grant from the state of Nebraska for $10,125, which should be millions today, to experiment with making salt. He had dug a 600-foot well someplace out here in the great dry lake bed and produced an artesian flow which shot an 8-inch, 8-foot-high gusher of water into the air, which was salt. Unfortunately, it was only about 35% on the salometer. What this means, I don't know. But they did know that it needed to be about 90 to 95% saline to be economically, commercially viable. So by 1885, with that experiment, that was the end of commercial gathering of salt in the area. It simply ceased. I don't know what's the matter here. Maybe my batteries are getting a little low. So in 1900, well, let's go back to that a little bit before that. In the late 1880s, a man by the name of Edward Bignell, who had been with the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad, opened on the dry lake bed a lake which he formed by damming Oak Creek. And he formed what he called an 1,000-acre lake, 6 to 7 feet deep, which is a pretty good-sized piece of water. He then purchased from Beatrice, Nebraska, a steamboat called the Belle of the Blue, put it on a flat car, and brought it to the city of Lincoln. The Belle of the Blue actually started its life in Crete, Nebraska, on the Blue River, and it operated there until the 1880s when it was moved to Beatrice. Then he brought it to the place here on a flat car, ran it out into his lake, and floated the Belle of the Blue. In this picture, we're looking towards probably the northwest. When I get out here, all definitions of north, south, east, and west kind of become fluid because the streets don't seem to run north, south, east, and west out here very well. So I think we're probably looking down that sort of a pier, if you will, which ran pretty much directly northwest, we think. And he built a pleasure grounds, which he called Burlington Beach. Now, Burlington Beach was named because it was on the right-of-way of the Burlington Railroad. He said that in the spring of 1896, his Burlington Beach had a crowd of 150,000 people one year. 150,000. Seems impossible until we look at the fact that unfortunately, or fortunately I should say, President McKinley visited, and in one day they had tens of thousands of people show up for an event, probably 1893. This is looking down that same pier again towards the Belle of the Blue. We can see it parked up there. There's a picture of the Belle of the Blue. The statistics on it vary greatly as to how many people it would take, but you could take an excursion and they actually serve drinks and food on the boat as well. By 1906, the property had changed hands once, and Mr. Big Dill had taken on a couple of partners. 1907, however, along comes the county. And the county says, you have built a dam on Oak Creek without permission. And this is not something you can do, so they dynamited it and drained the lake. Quietly, he went on. This was known as the Oak Creek Drainage District. And they were at that time straightening out Oak Creek for the first time. They removed the unauthorized dam, but in 1918, he just quietly went out and rebuilt the dam again and flooded the lake again. In the meantime, the land had changed hands, and name was changed from Burlington Beach to Capitol Beach. The question becomes, how do you spell Capitol Beach? Well, this is the Capitol Beach, a cabin camp, and in the distance off over there, I think is what you're looking at as the original schoolhouse, which sat here just up there on the hill. Not much to see. That's O Street is all. Did it spell its name capital A-L, or did it spell its name capital O-L? And the answer is yes. Some of the advertisements, they spelled it O-L, some of it A-L. Now, if it's spelled O-L, it refers to the Capitol building. And if it's spelled A-L, it refers to the Capitol city. So who knows? But they used both, so we have no way of knowing. And when I contacted, maybe it was Kyle, I said, which are we going to do, the history of A-L or O-L? And I think he said, we'll go with O-L. But this kind of shows you that maybe it was A-L. This is Capitol Beach Boulevard. We're looking again towards this sort of meandering street, which is running in this picture almost due north, but will soon change its course. Later, Mr. Koppel's house will be built right where that one is on the left. By the 1908 period, there was a swimming pool here, but it was just simply a crook in the creek, if you will, that had been flooded to form a natural swimming hole more than anything else. But at this time, we're going to begin building up the amusement park, which takes place in its wake. And W.H. Ferguson is now going to enter the picture, and he's going to buy the property as Capitol Beach. And W.H. Ferguson, his house is directly catty-corner from the Capitol building, the Ferguson Mansion. W.H. Ferguson also owned Woodlawn Dairy, which is out towards the other side of the airport. He owned Yankee Hill Brickyard. But his biggest investment was probably a little old company which he was the president and major owner of called Meadow Gold. So he did very well. But he also bought the Capitol Beach Amusement Park, and he began to add things. Here we're looking across the amusement park towards the northwest, and on the far end is the wooden jackrabbit or roller coaster. And he built lots and lots of things out there. Just kept adding and adding and adding. I just can't. I got to get new batteries, I guess. He also will build a swimming pool, which he will take water from the lake, from one of the many wellheads that's out there, and he will bring water over to this swimming pool. It's kind of hard for me to tell you where the swimming pool was, but back up to that picture where we saw the house on the left in Capitol Beach Boulevard, it would have been directly to the west of there, about half a block, directly to the west, so roughly in that area. 1926, he builds the saltwater pool, and he begins adding quite a few rides. They also advertised the park at that time as being a very healthful place to be. The air is pure, the water is pure, and the salt water that you bathe in will cure everything from rheumatism, cancer, to fallen arches. It cures anything. Pretty neat stuff. And then somebody was reminding me earlier that one of the times I spoke out here before, I talked about swimming in this lake, or excuse me, in this pool. They also brought in truckloads of sand, and you would, just like the city pools, you would go over on the right into the beach house, and then go out and swim. And I didn't care for it. I didn't care for it. As I said before, I discovered that after swimming here, there were tiny little crevices in your skin which started to itch that you didn't know even ever existed. From the salt started crusting and the sand got in there. I never cared for swimming in Capitol Beach. So only once. But it was very popular. Very, very popular. It took over several of the indoor, what they called natatoriums at the time. 1934, Mr. Koppel added a movie theater towards the northwest end of the amusement park. And the wooden roller coaster was ultimately going to be removed in the 1930s. And at that time, they used water, as I think I said, from one of the original saltwater wells and brought it over. Let's look at a couple of other pictures here. This is an aerial view. And you can kind of get, if you're not familiar with how the park was set up, this would be an east-west street, and this would be west. And right here is the Koppel House, and here comes Capitol Beach Boulevard. Okay, and we can see things like here's the Jackrabbit, or the wooden roller coaster. This area originally right in here was referred to as a balloon ascension field. So they would have hot air balloon rides out there. Lincoln had 2 hot air balloon ascension fields. The other one was at Landis Field, which is about where the city mission is today, and the ballpark in there. But you can see that the park has developed considerably in here. Here's the swing, the giant swing, the merry-go-round, the swimming pool, and over here is the King's Ballroom and the movie theater. And in this picture, you can also see for the first time, one of the times the water started to recede after they drained the lake. They would drain the lake, the water would recede, they'd build the dam back up, the water would fill up the lake again. Along the north side of what I'll call the Midway was this building, which existed very early on. It had many, many different purposes. They even had church in here on Sundays. It was a dance hall, dining hall, and the last thing I remember in there were the Dodgem cars, one of my favorites. Another aerial view, but this time we're looking towards O Street. You can see up at the top there the Bird and Surplus, and we can see down at the bottom where the balloon ascension field has been, there is now a racetrack in there for stock cars. And this was probably, would be in the 1950s, late 1950s era. And many of you remember the amusement park which developed around it. This would have been in the very early 60s, certainly. Lots of rides, lots of kids. Around the exterior of the park, also there was, for a nickel, you could ride this little train around. And it went all the way around the park, which was really originally intended to be picnic grounds. And not so very long, you could still find bits and pieces of where the picnic grounds were. There was the remnant of a swing set that I know that was still left, and virtually nothing else. This would have been off to the east end of the amusement park part of it. And everybody wants to know where this train ended up, but nobody that I know has ever figured out where it ended up. So fill in the blank for you. Kiddieland with little boats. Then the park is going to close in 1961. And with its closure, it'll be purchased by the Koppel families. I think they paid about $100,000 for the land. This keeps me awake at night. Did the Koppels ever come out of that okay? Golly, I don't know. But of course, this is where we also got into some legal shenanigans because the Koppels were leasing the land on one side of the lake and selling the lots on the other side of the land, and all sorts of new entanglements are going to exist. 1970, July the 4th, I was at Rich Bailey's house, which was on the east end of the lake, and I looked off over towards the amusement park, which was empty, and smoke was coming up. And I tried to take a picture, unaware of what it was. It was King's Ballroom burning to the ground. One local lad and his friend from Colorado were experimenting with some of Nebraska's native grasses to see if they would burn or smolder, and they burned the place down. There was nothing there at that time anyway, but down it went. The next thing that's going to happen, probably of any interest to the lake, is 2002-2003. And at that point in time, Craig Smith called me. I believe it was 2002. And he said, you know, they're going to do two things. They're going to dredge Holmes Lake, and they're going to dredge the Capitol Beach Lake, which has been silted in with maybe 4 to 6 inches of silt, so that the water is not as deep and is muddier. So they hired a company to come in and dredge the lake out, 2002. All sorts of stories started to appear as to what they might find when they drained the lake to dredge it. And my favorite was that they thought some of the original islands would appear, which they did. And also somebody said they thought the original wooden jackrabbit would suddenly come up out of the ground. Well, it had been completely taken down, so that was a bit of fiction. But at any rate, I went out to Craig's house, which I think it's next door to you, Greg? I'm not sure.
It's down the street.
Down the street a little bit. But let's call it on the south shore, okay? And I didn't know what he wanted me to come out there for, but he said he wanted me to see something. And so I went out summer's day, 2002, 2003, and it was right after lunch, and it was probably 142 degrees, I think, something like that. The sun was beating down. And we walked out his back door to his dock, and this is what I saw, and I took a picture. This is the same thing, literally, that was seen in the 1840s by Washington Irving's grandnephew, a dry lake with great cracks in the ground where you could stick your hand clear down in, up maybe to the elbow in places. Completely had drained the lake. Had a faint aroma of tuna fish, sort of, you know?
That's not what we call it.
And he said, I just want to walk out on the lake with you and see what we can see. I want to show you what we saw. One of the first things we saw was the remnants of a wooden pipe. And I took a piece of this home with me. I probably shouldn't have, but I knew the lake was going to be reflooded anyway. So I've got about a 4-foot section of this. There were 2 sections of wooden pipe. One of them was square and one of them was round. This would probably have been where water was taken, brine was taken from one of the original wells, either to one of those holding ponds or ultimately later in the 1920s over to the swimming pool. Don't know. Now in this picture we're looking at pieces of that pipe and we're looking off towards the northwest. And that's Craig's foot on the left up there. And we can see, that gives you an idea about how big this pipe is. It was buried just below the silt, going off towards the northwest. Now as I'm standing there, and we're talking, one of the things that we had noticed was a sort of a manhole cover with a crowbar laying on top of it, which was obviously badly rusted out, where one of the many wells that was dug out there would have existed but had simply been capped at some point in time. Without realizing it, it had suddenly become 2:15 in the afternoon. And we were standing talking, looking off towards the north, and as I turned around, I looked behind me, and I realized that this dry lake bed was suddenly no longer a dry lake bed. There was a lake forming behind me. See it up at the top of the picture? Those hydrostatic pressures forcing salt water up through the cracks in the ground was still at work. 150 years later, pushing salt water or brine up into the lake. So what did I do? Naturally, I went over and tested it. Very salty water. Still working. And so today when you go out there, was it you, Greg? Somebody said that once in a while you can still taste, or no, maybe it was Eric, that you sort of taste salt in the water a little bit. Well, there's still salt in the water because even though today that water is being supplemented by Lincoln water that's pumped into it, but a great amount of water that's coming off of drainage from the streets, from the driveways, from the rooftops and so forth. So fresh water is filling it in. But still, every day, twice a day, 2:30 in the morning and 2:30 in the afternoon, that water is coming back up, the salt water, because you can't get rid of the salt. And as fresh water dissolves it, it comes back up. It's pumping a small amount of salt water into that lake, and it's very slightly saline today. I have no idea what the salinity would be, but nothing like the 35 degrees, which it was back then. But there it is, still running to this day. What else did we see? This is a little hard to imagine. It was clearer when we looked at it that day. But if you can see these little pieces sticking up out of the ground, they are the remnants of the dock or the pier. We could see it running right straight out. This is where the Belle of the Blue came in on a railroad car. They put it onto the pier, if you will, ran it out and let it set in the water at that point. Then they took up the railroad tie. But as they picked up the railroad, they dropped the spikes. And I picked up half a dozen of these tiny little railroad spikes all along the pier. And I looked for one to bring with me today, but it's someplace in the great archaeological basement of my house, along with that wooden pipe. So there are still remnants left of what was going on at that point in time. And that is what is going on today. I don't think the wooden roller coaster ever did appear. I don't think the railroad train, which was intended to go to the city of Milford, the Lincoln and Capitol Beach and Milford Railroad, ever got beyond Capitol Beach, but it did go over the viaduct, we know that, and there were a great many people came out here, tens of thousands of people, but with the Copples, of course, came enlargement of the lakes with their new little areas out there, but all of that land would have at some point in time been part of this great inland lake. So this is about 35 or 40 minutes, and my wife said that anything more than 35 minutes listening to me becomes very similar to waterboarding. So I know enough to know when to quit and ask if there are any questions or comments.
No, waterboarding with salt.
Waterboarding with salt water. Yeah, back there.
Interstate, what happened there?
Okay, the interstate is the question, what happened there? Well, when the interstate was built across there, they cut off one edge of the lake as well. And I'm not sure today whether you drive out in the spring, but some time ago, say 5 years ago, I noticed when you would drive west on the interstate with the airport to your right, in the spring you would still see in the ditches, it would be white. Greg says he's still nodding. There's still salt water leaching up into those ditches out there today. And folks have actually gone out and harvested that salt, and it's still salt, but I don't know whether I would use it on my food or not, but nonetheless, it should be pretty much just pure salt. So the interstate cut off part of the end of the lake too. Now, one of the things I remember too, when Koppel bought it, one of the things he planned on doing was taking the land to the west of the drug company there and developing it. But he didn't do that right away. And if you were to look down on that land, up until about maybe 10 or 15 years ago, you would have seen pockets of water in there. And basically what those were the old creek, which got straightened out but left these little pockets of water. And also the remnants of the city of West Lincoln, which was a huge industrial city for less than 10 years. And the thing that caused that great industrial city of West Lincoln to fail was the salt. Because the area developed as meat packing, soap making, and other things out here. Huge industry, 2-, 3-story buildings that were covered entire city square blocks. But in order to make water and freeze it for refrigeration, it can't be salt water. And they soon used up all of the available, easily obtained fresh water. And when they got nothing but salt, that's one of the things in the 1890s. Along came the Depression of the 1893s, but that caused the city of West Lincoln to literally disappear. So that if you look at the 1880, 1890, and 1900 census, you see that there was never more than a few hundred people living here. But if you would go in between the censuses, you would see thousands of people living here. Hundreds of houses were taken out in the 1890s and moved to Havelock, for example, which was at that time growing as an industrial community. So I've drifted from the subject a little bit. Another question.
How deep was the lake at the time of the boat?
Well, at the time of the lake, Kyle asked, how deep was the lake? It was advertised as being between 6 and 7 feet, so I presume that would not be overall, but it would be in general. And I think when I was out here, Eric, what is it now? Is it still 6 and 7 feet deep in some places, I suppose? But not universally. And I think when they came back and dredged it, unfortunately, my understanding was that the dredging company that they hired to do it didn't do quite as good a job as the agency or the group was hoping, and they didn't take out as much as they hoped. So maybe the lake isn't as deep as it was, but I can't really speak to that. Okay, 6 to 7 feet. Yep, back there.
I had heard for years that Koppel, I don't know if he had done it or had just said that it was done, but there was supposedly like a clay cap of some kind on the bottom of the lake that if it was pierced or breached, that would cause problem with the saline.
Okay. The question was a sort of a, not a rumor, but something you had heard that said that the Koppels had formed some sort of a clay cap that kept this salt water in. I've never heard that before. Does anybody else know anything about that? I don't think so. And of course, what is it? It's bentonite that you would put into a lake to keep it from doing that, but it would take hundreds of sacks of bentonite, millions of sacks of bentonite to do that. So I don't think that's probably true, but I can't say for sure, and maybe somebody here can answer the question.
And I don't know if it was something he had put in or if it was just supposedly.
I don't think he put in much. I have my water engineer back here shaking his head no, Mr. Hansen. So I think I'm on pretty good grounds. And of course, in the last few years, Mr. Koppel has now come in, and that land to the west of the drug company, he's just cleansed it. And gone are the foundations of dozens of buildings, huge buildings, and the railroad tracks, and where the railroad tracks ran, it's all gone. He's cleansed it completely. So finding West Lincoln is pretty difficult anymore. You can find the old hotel building, you can find the old church, and that's just kind of it. Okay, another question. Okay.
Of course, a lot of people know about the oval racetrack, but Mark Koppel told me previous to that, they would come out here at night on a very flat place and would drag race.
Okay, yeah. He says that Ed Koppel used to come out, and where the racetrack, that oval track was, or the old balloon ascension field was, that the Koppels would come out here and drag race in the night. Absolutely, I would say that's undoubtedly true. It sounds like Mr. Koppel, and it sounds like exactly what you would have done out there, because it was flat and a great place. You also wouldn't get into a great deal of trouble, which some of us did in other places in Lincoln. But I'm thinking specifically of Arbor Road, but that's neither here nor there. If not, Kyle, I thank you very much. I hope I've answered most of your questions. Remember, if you come up afterwards, don't get too close to me, but I'll try to answer your questions. Thank you.